in places where you least expect it. Eyewitnesses are describing encounters in the wilderness with things that don't match anything else. Two friends in the woods are nearly taken by something that is clearly not human. Something wriggles in the dirt of a farmer's field, sparking panic, and a pair of hikers run across something without a face that terrorizes them. This episode will take you through 3 bizarre cases that refuse to be categorized and may point to something completely unknown. I'm Josh Dinocchio. This is What Lurks Beneath. You won't want to miss this one. In the foggy early morning hours of December 20th, 1958, 2 men were driving down Route 45 near a small town called Domston in Sweden. Hans Gustafsson, who at the time was 25, and his friend Stig Rydberg, who was 30, were headed from the town of Höganäs to Heisenberg. They were staying with Hans' mother, Anna Berggren, and both men worked at her dry cleaning business. It was around 3 in the morning, and the road was completely deserted. The men were very tired from a long night with their girlfriends, and it was taking everything in their power to stay alert on the road. But one of them decided that it would be a good idea to make a pit stop. They decided to just get out, stretch their legs for a few, and use the bathroom. Well, Hans, who was driving, pulls the car over to the side of the road, and as soon as they step out of the car, they notice a strange glow off to the side of the road, about 150 feet into the trees. Initially, they think that maybe it's just moonlight reflecting off of something metallic, like an old shed or something else. But the closer they look, the more they realize that this glow is just too consistent and too unnatural to be something that simple. No matter what angle they look at it from, it just stays so bright. And eventually, they get pretty curious, and they decide to go check it out. And so both Hans and Stig begin walking into the woods toward this glow, trying to make sure they don't stumble and fall in the dark. But as they get closer and closer, it's not so dark anymore. The light just keeps getting brighter and brighter, and eventually, they reach a small glade marked by a no camping sign. And what they see stops them dead in their tracks, because in the middle of the clearing is this disc-shaped object. It's unlike anything either of them have ever seen before, and it's about 15 feet wide and only about 3 feet high, and it's sitting on what looks like a tripod. Now, the object itself is throwing off this strange glow that is just shimmering and changing colors, but as they're stunned by what they're looking at, they notice movements all around the disc, and they begin to focus their eyes in the dim glow, and they soon realize that there are these bizarre creatures hopping around on the forest floor. And these things, from what they could tell, are about 3 feet long, and they look like gigantic protozoa, like they're made entirely out of jelly, and they're bluish in color and just bouncing around in this very strange way. And this is about the time that both men notice the weirdest smell. It could only be compared to like a mixture of burned sausage. It's enough to make them gag. Well, before they can even turn and run, these living jelly beans suddenly rush toward them at lightning speed, and within seconds, they swarm over them, latching onto their arms and legs. And there isn't any heat or cold from their touch, just this weird gelatinous pressure that feels almost kind of like magnetic dough. Now, as you'd imagine, both of them are in a state of complete panic and shock. They're screaming and struggling, trying to break free, but the more they struggle, the tighter the grip gets. And every now and then they kind of manage to pull away from one of these blobs, but the instant they do, another one grabs hold to take its place. Both even try punching these things, but soon realize that their fist passed right through them, and they don't come back out too easily. Now, at one point, Stig punches one, only to have his entire arm enveloped all the way up to his elbow, and weirdest of all, it was almost like these things were anticipating every move that they tried, like they could read the men's minds. Somehow, Stig eventually manages to tear himself away from these things that are weighing him down, and he books it through the trees, straight back toward the car. And as he takes off, he can hear Hans still screaming behind him, and when he's just a few feet away, he takes a chance and glances behind him and sees that Hans is wrapped around the sign that says no camping, literally holding on for dear life. And by that I mean these things are dragging away his lower body and pulling him in their direction. But all he could do was watch as Stig keeps sprinting for the car with his own pair of blobs in close pursuit. Stig reaches the car, jumps inside, and immediately just lays on the car horn. He isn't sure why, other than thinking that maybe there's somebody else here who might hear it and come to the rescue. Now, amazingly, it works for a different reason. After a few seconds of continuous honking, the two things chasing Stig turn and leave. And coming the opposite direction towards the car is Hans. He bursts out of the trees as fast as he can towards the passenger seat. He jumps in, yelling about how the blobs let go the moment that the horn sounded, and at the same time, they see the disc-shaped object suddenly rising up from the clearing. And it hovers there for just a moment and then shoots up into the night sky, and disappears. All in all, the entire experience from the moment they spotted the glow until the object disappeared, lasted only about 5 minutes. But it takes about 20 minutes for both men to stop shaking enough so that they could drive home. And during that time, the foul stench just lingered in the air. It was stuck in their nose. And after they had calmed down enough to drive, they headed straight towards Hans' mother's house. But of course, they didn't tell her or anybody else about what happened. They were just in such a state of shock that they were afraid that if they told people what they had seen, nobody would believe them. They would be labeled crazy or liars. But over the course of the next 3 days, both men showed signs of their fight with these. They had visible bruises on their bodies where these things had grabbed them, and their eyes were red, and Stig in particular was severely affected. The 72 hours that had transpired since, he hadn't slept. Every time he would try to sleep, he would just jolt awake in panic. Now today, we would have recognized a lot of their symptoms as consistent with PTSD. Now, the two men couldn't keep it a secret anymore. They sat down with Hans' family and they told them everything. Hans' mother was obviously deeply concerned, and not only because of what her son and his friend claimed to have experienced, but also because of their physical condition and Stig's inability to sleep. Surprisingly, Anna believed them, and she decided that this story needed to be told. So she contacted Sweden's largest newspaper, the Helsingborgs Dagblad, and reported the incident. It was a decision that would thrust both men into the spotlight in a way they never expected. Now, once the story went public, it of course spread like wildfire, and eventually all around. This story circulated so much in the public that it caught wind in UFO circles and became known as the Domston Blobs, or the Domston Jellybags. Of course, not everyone was so quick to believe. Now, a few weeks later, on January 7th, 1959, a Swedish ufologist named Sven Schalen interviewed Hans and Stig about it. And just 2 days after, on the 9th, they were called into the police station for an official interview. Now, this wasn't just any run-of-the-mill interview. It was actually a very intense interrogation that lasted for 11 hours. Because the story was just so crazy and it was blowing up, that law enforcement were determined to find inconsistencies in their story. And so they questioned them both separately, and together they went over every detail multiple times with a fine-toothed comb. And again, they were looking for any hint that this might be a hoax or a made-up story, and determined to prove that this was fake, they even went as far as to secretly record both them when they were alone, hoping to catch them contradicting each other. But no matter how hard they tried and pried, and they just couldn't catch Hans or Stig in a lie. Both of them maintained the exact same account of what had happened down to the smallest details. There were no inconsistencies or anything to suggest that they were lying. After the grueling police interview, the men were given medical and psychiatric evaluations, and the results of these tests only added to the mystery. Both were pronounced physically and mentally sound. There was no evidence of drug or alcohol abuse, nor any mental disorders that suggested they had hallucinated. Now, of course, in the midst of all of this, the Swedish military declared that this was just simply a hoax. But of course, even they offered no explanation. Unfortunately, whatever the truth may be, the Domston blobs remains one of the strangest and weirdest cases to come out of Sweden. When you hear about people encountering things like what we just talked about, blob monsters, you probably think back to old cheesy sci-fi movies. Well, interestingly, Hans and Stig's encounter with the Domston blobs took place just over 3 months after the original horror film, The Blob, debuted. But our next story, or case I should say, with a bizarre blob took place way before that movie ever came out, halfway across the world in the early 20th century. This case actually comes from UFO researcher and friend Albert Rosales. And by that I don't mean that Albert researched it or discovered it in a book or database somewhere. It was actually a story that he heard from his own grandmother. So according to his grandmother, the encounter took place near the small town of Jicotea in Cuba. In 1915, 2 men were out on horseback patrolling the perimeter of a large sugarcane plantation. These men were armed guards hired by the owner to protect the crops from any thieves. This was common practice, as sugarcane was an extremely valuable commodity, and theft, unfortunately, was a very constant problem. So these 2 guards had been doing this job for years already, and every night they would mount their horses, ride along the same route, circling the plantation before heading back. In fact, they had done this so many times they could practically do it with their eyes closed. The horses knew the route just as well, and most nights there was nothing really ever to report. But on this evening, something very strange was about to unfold. The guards were moving along a section that ran along the edge of the sugarcane field when suddenly both horses just stopped. When this happened, neither of the men was concerned because they figured that maybe the horses had spotted a snake or some other animal on the path ahead of them that had spooked the horses. But no matter how hard they tried, the guards just couldn't get their horses to budge. And then the horses began behaving strangely. Their ears pinned back against their heads, and they began to snort and stamp their hooves into the dirt. I mean, these horses were clearly agitated. They refused to move forward no matter what. And these guards were also experienced horsemen, as you can imagine. And they had been around horses their entire lives. They knew the horses could sense things that humans couldn't. So they looked ahead on the path, trying to figure out what was the matter, and they couldn't see anything unusual. But then one of them noticed something on the ground just off to the side of the trail. And whatever it was looked to be this small white object, about the size of a small sack of flour. But in the darkness, it's hard to make out detail. And so the guard pointed the thing out to his partner, and they both stared at this strange white bundle, trying to figure out what on earth they were looking at. And suddenly this thing moved, and the 2 of them stopped, and they watched as this white sack-like object began to shift and writhe on the ground. Now, neither of them could believe what they were looking at because clearly it was alive, and now that it's moving, it doesn't really look like cloth anymore. It just could have all been a living blob or a gigantic worm or a grub. Now, at any rate, the horses were now in a complete panic, trying desperately to back up and turn around, but now it was the guards who refused to move. They held their mounts in place, focused on the bizarre sight right in front of them, and to their horror, the white bundle began to move again, and it moved positions. It started to crawl right toward them. Granted, it wasn't moving quickly, but it was definitely headed in their direction, inching closer to the horses. Well, it all got to be too much for one of the guards. Overcome with fear and simply unable to process what he was seeing, he pulled out his gun, without hesitating, opened fire on this object. And guys, this is where the story really gets into what we call the tall tale territory. So bear with me. So whether or not this is true is anyone's guess, but according to the story, each time one of the guards' shots hit this thing, it grew, like the Incredible Hulk, and by the time the guard was finished unloading his pistol, it had nearly swollen to the size of the horses themselves. Now, at this point, one of the men was thrown from his horse, the other jumped down, and both of them raced out of that field, abandoning their post. Back at the plantation, they told others what they had seen, but of course, nobody believed them. People assumed they had been drinking or had simply seen an animal and had panicked. But the 2 knew it, and strangely, it's isolated cases like these that are just so bizarre that nobody really has an answer for what it was these two men experienced. Whatever it was, will remain a mystery. In the early 1960s, in the small town of Kinderhook, New York, about 20 miles south of Albany, something strange began happening in the forest. Over the course of several years, multiple eyewitnesses would report encountering something that left them absolutely bewildered. Something that may still be seen to this very day. On a warm summer day in 1962, a 10-year-old boy named Bruce Hallenbeck and his 7-year-old cousin Shari were playing in the woods near their grandparents' house off McCagg Road. These two were very close and would often spend a lot of time together, especially during the summers when school was out. And on this day, they were doing what kids love to do: explore the forest, climb trees, and just have fun being kids. Now, at some point during their adventures, both of them were interrupted by a strange noise. They suddenly heard this weird, almost high-pitched kind of whistling sound, but it was coming from deeper in the woods. Initially, they kind of just looked at each other and, they wondered what could have made the noise, but right away, it was clear that this wasn't the case. At first, they were looking at each other, thinking that the other had made the noise, but it became pretty clear that this wasn't the case. Before either of them could say anything, the noise took up again, and being curious, they're like, let's go investigate. And so they start walking in the direction of the sound, not really scared, but very intrigued, and as they get closer to the source, they begin to slow down a bit, because something about this sound is just really off. It wasn't like a bird or any other animal that they'd ever heard before, so they went a little further, slower now, and then, as they approached a large pine tree, they both stopped, because there, partially hidden behind this pine tree, was this odd white object. It wasn't exactly solid, but it wasn't really transparent either. It was this white mass peeking out from behind the tree, and it seemed to kind of have these appendages that kind of looked like arms wrapped around the trunk. I mean, you couldn't really say it was shaped like a human being. It was just too amorphous. And this object also had no visible eyes, and there was no face. It was just this formless, bluish white thing looking out from behind the tree. Obviously, it didn't take long for the kids to hightail it out of there, and without saying a word to each other, they both turned and sprinted back through the woods toward the house, not stopping until they were safely inside. Now, this wasn't an isolated incident, because 2 years later, in 1964, another encounter occurred in that same section near Kinderhook. This time, it involved an unnamed friend of Bruce's who was hiking alone on the trail. And as this boy's walking along, he noticed